Okay, let's try again. I want to see if I can talk in the most informal way to introduce Henri Corbin and why I think he's important, and to explain perhaps a little bit of how he changed my life over the last 25 or so years. So I'm going to speak to you as if you've never heard of him before. And I'm going to talk about his life and work. So what I want to do is to show you a slideshow so that you can follow along, as it were, which means I need to do a screen share. Which this should be doing. And here we go. You should be seeing the introductory slide. And we'll hope that we don't have any technical glitches. So this is Imaginal Love, the life and work of Henri Corbin. He was French, and he was born in Paris in 1903 and died in Paris in 1978. Just by way of introducing him and giving you some context, he was a theologian and a philosopher, and his specialty was Islamic mysticism, particularly Persian, Iranian mysticism, particularly medieval Persian mysticism. So he was a scholar and a polyglot. He spoke and read many languages, as we'll see. But he came to the attention of people outside of his immediate circle of scholarship because he attended the Eranos meetings, which were C.G. Jung's group in Ascona, Switzerland. And Corbin was there from, I think 1949 until he died. He came and spoke there in Switzerland almost every year from 1949 on. And so he was in the circle of Jung and Eliade and Isutsu and eventually Hillman, James Hillman, and David Miller, and a whole host of scholars active particularly in religious studies, in psychology, and in spirituality from an ecumenical worldwide perspective. So his work was translated into English because of that connection with the Eranos group. It appeared in English in the Bollingen series, published by Princeton University Press, beginning in the early 50s. So his work reached a much wider audience than it would have otherwise, given the nature of his scholarship. And as an attendant, as a lecturer, a primary and very important lecturer at Eranos, his target audience was educated people interested in religion and spirituality, so that it forced him to speak to an audience wider than that which he might normally have had. So that's really why we know about him. But it's worth also mentioning that he gained, because of the English translations, he gained a certain status among poets and artists in the United States from the 1950s on. And because his work had, as you'll see, a real applicability to creativity, particularly in language. Many poets in the United States in particular, and to some extent in England, were really very taken with his work. And so that spread his influence even farther. But to begin, he was born well, no. Let's do this. Let me begin by explaining very briefly how I learned about Corbin, because that will be important later on. Beginning in about 1990, I became aware of the work of the American psychologist, Jungian psychologist, James Hillman. And I loved what I read about his work. And it was by reading Hillman that brought Corbin to my attention. In a wonderful essay called The Thought of the Heart, Hillman begins with this paragraph: "You who have been privileged at some time during his long life to have attended a lecture by Henri Corbin have been present at a manifestation of the thought of the heart. You've been witness to its creative imagination, its theophanic power of bringing the divine face into visibility. You will also know in your hearts that the communication of the thought of the heart proceeds in that fashion of which he was master, as a récit, an account of the imaginal life as a journey among imaginal essences, an account of the essential. In him, imagination was utterly presence. One was in the presence of imagination itself, that imagination in which and by which the spirit moves from the heart towards all origination." Well, when I read that, I thought to myself, who is this man? Because I need to know what he did. I was so enchanted by Hillman's work on the imagination. And if Hillman thought this highly of this person, then I was going to have to find out. So I immediately bought myself a copy of Corbin's book on Ibn Arabi, Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and began to try to read it. And I have been that was in about 1991 or 92, and I've been thinking about Henri Corbin on and off ever since. Here's a very rare photo of Corbin speaking at the Eranos conferences on the shores of Lago Maggiore in Ascona, northern Italy. So Corbin was born in 1903. His mother died shortly after he was born, and he was raised by his aunt and uncle. And here is young Henri at about 5 with his aunt. And here he is again in a couple other pictures, the young Henri Corbin in Paris in 1910 or so. And here he is as a young man. He attended the Sorbonne. He was educated in the Catholic tradition as a young man, and then he went to the Sorbonne, where he studied theology and philosophy. And he studied under some of the leading scholars of the time, including Étienne Gilson. Gilson was investigating in those days the relationships between Islam and Christianity in the Middle Ages. And that was no doubt where Corbin first became aware of Islamic thought and its relationship to Western thought. He was also a student, very importantly, of Louis Massignon, a great French mystic and priest and scholar who wrote a massive book on Al-Hallaj, the Islamic mystic from North Africa. And Massignon was a formative influence on everyone who took courses with him, and he took a special interest in Henri Corbin, as you'll see in a little bit. And also it was via his ties to Massignon, in a way, that Corbin was invited to Eranos, because when Massignon left Eranos, he was replaced by Corbin. And also Corbin took his chair at the Sorbonne when Massignon retired. It was in 1922 or 3, I think, that Massignon gave Corbin a copy of Shoravardi's Hikmat al-Ashraq, the Theology of Illumination, or at least that's how Corbin translates it. This was a manuscript, an unpublished manuscript of 500 or so pages by Shoravardi, who was a 12th century Persian philosopher. And Massignon thought that Corbin would find it interesting, which he did. And he was to say later on, Corbin, that Shoravardi was really his own personal master. And he spent years reading and translating and then publishing manuscripts by Shoravardi. And here things get a little peculiar, because we've heard so far that Corbin was a scholar of Islam and religion. But he was also the first French translator of Heidegger. And there's an entire strain in Corbin's biography and in his thought, which would lead one to believe that he was a scholar of Western philosophy, particularly German thought, Husserl and Heidegger. And then before that, medieval German theology and mysticism. So these seemingly contradictory strains in Corbin's thought are beautifully brought together when we recognize, when we learn that Corbin's own copy of Being in Time, in German, of course, was full of his little marginal notes written in Persian and Arabic. because at the same time that he was reading Heidegger, he was reading and translating Suravarti, and he was discovering what he saw to be really interesting common themes in these two seemingly distinct and radically different approaches to what it means to be a human being. And that peculiar tension, although Corbin didn't see it as a tension, that peculiar dual track runs all through Corbin's world. And it's here, it's worth saying that one of Corbin's chief preoccupations was to show how the particularly religious traditions of East and West share common themes. Now, he was primarily a scholar of Christian thought and Islamic thought, but he was aiming his theology at what he called the peoples of the book, the Abrahamic tradition as a whole. So he was looking to show that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share certain fundamental assumptions and common themes, and that the discord and the strife and the warring between these religions is based on terrible misunderstandings. Now, one of the things that allowed him to see that was to understand Heidegger's brand of philosophical anthropology, which is based on an idea of hermeneutics, which is interpretation. And this runs off into philosophical complexities pretty quickly. But keep in mind that the term hermeneutics, meaning interpretation, in the West, in Western Europe, was first applied to biblical analysis. And Heidegger is completely aware of that. And in fact, he knows that medieval tradition of biblical textual analysis really well. And Heidegger, in Being and Time, among other things, is suggesting that something like a textual interpretation, something like that, is really capable of providing the best way of understanding human beings. That's where all the analysis of Dasein comes in. Heidegger says, well, science, chemistry, physics, biology, psychology, sociology, history, all of those can teach you things about what it means to be human, but none of them are fundamental. They're all ways of understanding. But if we're really looking for the fundamental philosophical ground for interpreting what it means to be human, to be conscious in the world, our best method is going to be something like a textual interpretation. And then he devotes much of his life to trying to unpack what that means. So Corbin is reading this at the same time that he's reading Suravarti and other Islamic mystics, for whom, of course, the Quran, the holy book, is utterly central. And the idea of understanding all of creation as a kind of text is absolutely central. There's a term that I may as well mention now that Corbin is very fond of in the Persian literature and the Arabic literature called taqwil, which means hermeneutics. It means spiritual hermeneutics. It's a kind of interpretation which has motive force and the power, almost an alchemical power of changing the person who engages in it. It's in that sense very close to poetry and music, both of which are kinds of actions which change the being of the practitioner, the reader, the player. And so when he's reading Heidegger about interpretation and Shuravardi about taqwil, the two just beautifully meld together in Corbin's mind, which is why his glosses and Being in Time are in Persian and Arabic. He's, I would suspect, the only person in the world who was thinking this way at the time. He was also profoundly affected by Nikolai Berdyaev, the great Russian philosopher. And in fact, Corbin was the president of the Paris branch of the Berdyaev Society for many years. This is a connection. It signals a connection that Corbin had with Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Russian and Greek and Byzantine. Corbin thought that Eastern Christianity maintained a kind of mystical orientation which the Roman Church began to lose in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries and on. So Corbin is often seen to be drawing on aspects of Russian thought insofar as it's tinged with this Eastern Orthodox Christian mysticism, of which Corbin was extremely fond. So the importance of Berdyaev in Corbin's work shouldn't be overlooked. As a young man, Corbin was pretty clearly not shy and very interested in meeting personally with the people whose works he was studying. So he went to Germany many times in these years before the outbreak of war to meet with Heidegger and others, because, as I said, he was translating bits and pieces of Heidegger. And in actual fact, as the first French translator of Heidegger, his works as a translator were known pretty widely in the 30s and 40s. During one of his trips to the north to visit a couple of religious scholars in Sweden, Corbin wrote a meditation called Theology by the Lakeside. And he wrote it in 1932. So he's in his late 20s. And I'm going to read it to you because it speaks volumes about Corbin's state of mind and the content of his theology at this time. Here it is. in English, but that won't do you very much good. So here it is in Portuguese. And it reads as follows, in my translation, I should say. It's a much longer piece, and I've been quite selective in pulling fragments from it, so it would be best if you were to read the whole thing for yourselves. But here's some fragments from Theology by the Lakeside. It will soon be dusk, but for now the clouds are still clear. The pines are not yet darkened, for the lake brightens them into transparency. And everything is green with a green richer than pulling all the organ stops in recital. It must be heard seated, very close to the earth, arms crossed, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. For it is not necessary to strut about like a conqueror and want to give a name to things, to everything. It is they who will tell you who they are if you listen, yielding like a lover. For suddenly for you in the untroubled peace of this forest of the north, the earth has come to the vow, visible as an angel that would perhaps be a woman. And in this apparition, this greatly green and thronging solitude, the angel too is robed in green, the green of dusk, of silence, and of truth. Then there is in you all the sweetness that is present in the surrender to an embrace that triumphs over you. At each moment where you read in truth, as now, what is there before you, where you hear the angel and the earth and woman, then you receive everything in your absolute poverty. You are the poor one, you are man, and he is God, and you cannot know God or the angel or the earth or woman. You must be encountered, taken, known, that they may speak. Otherwise, you're alone. Well, there's just so much in this brief quotation, which is indicative of Corbin's entire philosophical, theological worldview. I'll just pull out a couple things here. Everything is green with a green richer than pulling all the organ stops in a recital. There are musical metaphors everywhere in Corbin's work, and where they're not explicit, they're implicit. For Corbin, music is probably the central form of language. And he takes the medieval notion of the music of the heavens very seriously indeed. It is not necessary to strut like a conqueror. He runs against the entire tenor of modern thought and life. It's a mystical vision of the plenitude available from the angel of the earth and from God, if only we could learn to be receptive. He refers to the poverty, human poverty here, which he calls mystical poverty. And just to make another brief linkage here, this idea comes to him from several sources, but primary among them is Martin Luther's notion of the significatio passiva, the passive signification. We don't really have characteristics that are not given to us by the divine source. Corbin thinks that everything we have is given to us, and we make a terrible mistake when we turn possessive and controlling, and that is a primary form of I was going to say sin, but sin isn't a category for Corbin. Misunderstanding would be better. And of course, the idea of the earth as an angel. Corbin is extremely fond of angels and what he calls angelology for lots of reasons, which I suppose we could get to eventually. Here's another comment about Corbin from a friend in the same year that he wrote the Theology by the Lakeside. Wait a minute. There we go. Letter of August 21st, 1932. A friend wrote this about him. This Corbin is quite the most erudite man I have ever met. He is baffling. He knows French, German, Italian, Spanish, English, Arabic, and Persian, and enough to read Sanskrit, Turkish, Dutch, Swedish, and Latin. He is immersed in Arabic mysticism and is familiar with every turn of contemporary German philosophy and theology, all the representatives of which he knows personally. But above all knowledge is for him directly linked to his immediate existential task. That is, he hates history when it's other than a presentation of things and men, and he revolts vehemently against so many psychological, cautious, and unreal French methods. Simply said, he's a Christian. He is quite a rare and benevolent French type. And I will only add that later on he learned to read Syriac, Aramaic, and Russian. He wanted to read Berdyaev and Bulgakov and others in the original Russian, so he learned that too. But you see here, all knowledge is for him directly linked to his immediate existential task. Corbin spoke of his work as a kind of phenomenology of the religious consciousness. So he knew Husserl and the phenomenologists exceedingly well, not just Heidegger. And he was interested in, as he would say, valorizing mystical and religious experience in the face of modernist rationalism, which he rejected entirely. And his approach was phenomenological. And also, of course, his multicultural sensibilities were profoundly important to him. Knowing so many languages and moving as he did every year between Paris and Switzerland and Iran, he was a cosmopolitan, multilinguistic, multicultural, ahistorical kind of consciousness, which is rare indeed in any culture. In 1933, he married Stella Leonhardt, and she outlived him by many years. They had no children, and Stella acted as his muse and his lover and his protectress for many years while Corbin was devoted to his books and his studies. And I think here we have a few photos from a website which I highly recommend. There's in Paris, the Association des Amis d'Henri and Stella Corbin, www.amicorbin.com. All these photos can be found there and many more. It's really rather a wonderful website. I believe this is Stella and her sister on the right, though I'm not sure. They certainly look as though they may be related. But in any case, it's Henri and Stella and an unnamed woman. And none of these photos are dated, by the way. Here's one of my favorite photos of Corbin. I don't know where it is. I neglected to mention that he was quite an accomplished musician. He learned to play keyboards very early in his life. He was an organist of some talent. And I love this photo of Henri with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and it always looks to me as if he should be playing jazz, but I'm sure that he wasn't. And this, I don't know where this was. This could well have been at the Eranos conferences. So after he had worked at the Bibliothèque Nationale for a few years, he was working on translations of Shuravardhi, and he landed a job working for the French Institute of Archaeology, which sent him to Istanbul, where he was going to search out unknown, unpublished manuscripts in the library there. As it turned out, he and Stella spent the entire period of the war in Istanbul. And during that time, Corbin became thoroughly immersed in Shuravardhi's work. One of the things that occurs to me to mention now is that one of the reasons that Corbin felt an attraction to Shuravardhi is precisely Shuravardhi's multicultural, ecumenical cosmopolitanism, to put it in a way. Now, Shuravardhi is a 12th century Persian, but one of Shuravardhi's self-proclaimed tasks was to show how prior Persian religion was not in essential conflict with the Islamic faith which supplanted it. And the prior Persian religion was Zoroastrianism. Now, one of the other amazing, quite stunning things about Corbin is that he writes a great deal about Zoroastrianism, and in a way that makes it clear that he took Zoroastrian religion extremely seriously. One of the first essay that he wrote that was translated into English is, in fact, a comparison of Zoroastrian angelology and the angelologies of Islam. And so in the same way that Shuravardhi was trying to show the relationships, the positive relationships between Zoroastrianism as a prophetic religion and Islam, Corbin was trying to show the overarching harmony among the religions of the book, in which he included Zoroastrianism. So for Corbin, there's this great sweep of the history of prophecy from Zoroaster through all of the prophets of the Old Testament. Jesus becomes a major prophet. Then Muhammad, and then though the Muslims would say, and Corbin would give a nod to this, that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets. Corbin thought, well, that's not, he may be the seal of prophecy, but that's not closure. More developments can and in fact must continue if the prophetic tradition is to remain alive and well, because a religion without creativity will die, and it will die the death of fundamentalism. Corbin's entire opus is you could in some sense say his entire opus is an attack on any kind of fundamentalism, whether scientific or religious or political. Corbin shows the necessity of the creative imagination for the continuance of human history in this religious context. So Istanbul, 1940, several years spent in the library there. At the close of the Second World War, Corbin goes to Tehran with Stella, of course, and he discovers there a profound attraction to the country, which he called a country the color of heaven. He was to become a professor of philosophy at Tehran University, and in his from about 1949 on, he traveled there, well, maybe even from 45, he traveled there every year to teach until his death in 78, which was just before the Iranian Revolution, which he did not live to see, and which would have upset him terribly. They came back to Paris in 1946. And in 49, he began attending the Eranos conferences in Ascona. Now, as I mentioned, he took Louis Massignon's place there, and he also took Massignon's position when Massignon retired as chair of the Department of the Religions of Arabia, as it was called back then. And so from about 1949 until his death, Corbin had 3 locations every year. He would teach in Paris, then he would go to Tehran to teach, then he would go to the Eranos conferences, which I believe were usually in the spring. And so that was the trajectory of his life from 49 through 76. And at the Eranos conferences, of course, he met C.G. Jung, and there's an interesting note here. If you look at the articles that Corbin wrote during the early period of his attendance at Eranos, he adopts some of Jung's terminology. And my interpretation is that he just found that it fit with what he was saying. He didn't need the terminology, but he could use it with these audiences because much of what he was saying seemed to fit quite well with some of Jung's psychological approach. On the other hand, Corbin wanted to be quite clear that he was not a psychologist and that he was, in fact, a theologian, and that he really didn't want to be in a position to have to defend the psychologization of religious experience. And I think partly for that reason, after a few years, the quasi-Jungian terminology simply disappears from his writing. He just doesn't really need it. He has other terms which suffice and which don't have the connotation of reductionism with which Jung himself was always struggling in one sense or another. Here's some more pictures, one or two anyway, of Corbin and Jung. I think it's probably, let me go back, I think it's probably fair to say, although Jung was, I guess, maybe 20 years older than Corbin, they had a lot in common. I'm not sure that it's true to say that either substantially affected the work of the other. They were each working similar kinds of territories, and so they had much to discuss, but it wasn't a master-pupil relationship in any sense. Both of these brilliant thinkers had, by the time they met, both attained their intellectual maturity. And so there was really no need, there was no opportunity for very much influence one way or the other. Here's Corbin on the left, and Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, on the right. And the young guy in the middle is Robert Bosnak, who's an American psychologist who was there in those years and to whom Corbin took a liking. I love to tell a story that Bosnak mentions in one of his books, which is really revealing of Corbin's approach in these years. You can see, I think, in this picture, Corbin was getting on in age. He always, for many years, he wore hearing aids. And he would, according to Bosnak, he would often, during meetings that he didn't want to pay much attention to, he would often turn them off and be effectively deaf. So he spent a lot of time in his own little world. And in fact, he said to Bosnak once, "Most of my contemporaries have been dead for 1,000 years." He very much felt that he was living in the world of medieval Persian mysticism or medieval Christian mysticism, and that there were precious few people in the world of scholarship and philosophy with whom he had very much in common, although that was less true at the Eranos conferences, for sure. Here's Corbin, one of my favorite pictures. He could be quite passionate, as it turns out, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. Here he is in '66 with James Hillman and Gilbert Durand, the great French anthropological thinker. And there he is at the famous round table by the shores of Lago Maggiore at Eranos. I actually have a slide. I want to tell you a little story. which I thought was in, oh, I don't have it. I'm going to have to edit this out. I don't have that little story. Here's from Stella's memoir of Henri's last days. She writes, on the 26th of September, the doctor authorized the return to Rue Odillon. Henri, overjoyed, barely slept, planned to finish his works, and then, slightly troubled, asked the doctor, but do you think I can finish this book? Dr. Gonneau says, oh, I know you. Even if you had 100 years ahead of you, you would ask me the same question. You'd have yet another urgent book to finish, and many more besides. Corbin replied, that may well be. The thing is, you see, with my books, I'm struggling against the same thing as you. Each in our own way, you as a doctor and I as historian of religions, are engaged in the same struggle. We're leading a campaign against death. That's incredibly intense. He was buried in a little cemetery north, it was a couple of maybe 15, 20 kilometers north of Paris. And as a kind of epitaph here, let me leave you with a quote from him. To be a philosopher is to take the road, never settling down in some place of satisfaction with a theory of the world, not even a place of reformation, nor of some illusory transformation of the conditions of this world. It aims for self-transformation, for the inner metamorphosis, which is implied by the notion of a new or spiritual rebirth. The adventure of the mystical philosopher is essentially a voyage which progresses towards the light. Now, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. There's so much to be said about Corbin's work. It is profound and beautiful, endlessly interesting, which is kind of a problem for me because every time I teach or read some of his material, I see new connections. It really is endlessly revelatory. But in the end, the effect on me, certainly over the years, has been to slowly break down the walls of certainty. Corbin's vision of the function and place of creative imagination means that we have to become capable of a kind of experience of the world which is comfortable with a certain amount of flux and uncertainty and change in order to experience the creative energies that are latent in us and in all things. It's characteristic of certain kind of human psychology that we are uncomfortable when we are uncertain and when we're confronted by change. And that leads to, in extremes, it leads to all sorts of fundamentalisms. Corbin is sketching for us an experience, not just the ideas, but the experience of a world which is so highly charged with the energy of transformation that it should become clear to us the endless possibilities which lie right at our fingertips, but that we have such trouble learning to interact with in positive ways. Now, it should be said that though it's more true of some of his works than of others, he can be very difficult to read because he doesn't cut you much slack, as we might say in America. His range of reference and the knowledge, the breadth of knowledge which he presupposes can be really kind of daunting. But I would say that his best works and creative imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi is maybe primary among them. His best works can be read whether you understand everything or not. I think his best writing conveys a certain love for the world and shows a certain beauty and enthusiasm for the life of the imagination, that it transfers to you whether you're understanding everything that he says or not. So there, I guess I will leave you with that as an introduction to Henri Corbin. And over the next series of talks, we'll delve more deeply into his works and their implications for us in the modern world. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to getting together again soon. Well, there we go. I hope that will do.